Good morning, everybody. We are going to continue the discussion on novel as a literary type. In the previous class, we have seen how in the 18th century, novel developed as a kind of new genre in prose fiction. And after writers like Ben, Daniel Defoe, there came in the scene Samuel Richardson, who gave a particular sub-form called epistolary to the art of novel, and it was basically a psychologically realistic representation of middle class mentality, middle class morality in the changing scenario of 18th century society in England. A junior contemporary of Samuel Richardson, Fielding, he began as a sort of satirist against the kind of writing Richardson was offering us. He did not feel comfortable with Richardson's kind of overemphasis on the middle class morality and sentimentality. So, he started by making a sort of pastiche, a kind of parody of Richardson's Pamela, which is called Shamela. So the name itself is very ironic, satiric, you can see. But gradually Fielding developed his own style, his own narrative technique, and this gave rise to another major subform in the world of novel writing, that is the social realistic novel. In his future works like Joseph Andrews, like Tom Jones, which is described very often as a comic epic in prose, he brings about the wide panoramic vision of the British society, covering the rural England, the frontier positions, at the same time London, the very center of city life, and how the hero's journey through all these spheres of city and country life, he is falling in several trials and travails. He is being a basically inherently good character, but at the same time he is falling into several kinds of mistakes or youthful follies, all these things. And at the same time, the protagonist's encounter with so many people, so many other communities having different kinds of customs, different kinds of beliefs. Tom Jones is not simply meeting with people belonging to his own class. In fact, he began his journey as a declassed person because he was a foundling. He was abandoned at his birth and he was brought up by Squire Allworthy and then by the evil strategies of Blifil, he fell out with this benefactor uncle figure and he was thrown out of the house. And when he continues his journey across the vast country and city life across England, he meets not only people belonging to his own community and own class. He meets several types of people, from barmaids to hermits to gypsy kind of people to some reclusive dweller, highwaymen. So these different kinds of people he is meeting with, and finally his experience turns out to be a positive thing, which of course ultimately have the moral assertion that inherent goodness, despite its youthful follies or some outward ways of mistaking about life, these have the question of retribution, repentance and reformation. So, in this way, Fielding gave rise to a very important and popular subgenre of novel, that is the social realistic novel. To call it a type or subtype, we may say that it is characterized as the fictional attempt to give the effect of reality by representing complex characters with complex views, motives, and intentions who are rooted in one or more than one social class or classes, who can function in a developed social structure, whether it is in the countryside, in rural life, or in the center of the city, in urban life, who interact with many other characters with different motives and undergo very plausible and everyday modes of life experience. This novelistic mode, rooted thus in 18th century writers like Richardson to some extent, but his vision of realism was limited, especially to the lower middle class, virtuous men and women. So this was his arena of exploration. But Fielding was much more dynamic, vast and expansive. And afterwards, in the 19th century, we see the same technique, of course, with some kind of innovation, with some kind of individualistic touch, came to be developed further by writers like Jane Austen, George Eliot, Anthony Trollope, Charles Dickens, William Dean Howells in England and America, and also in Stendhal, Balzac and Flaubert in France. And to speak of Russia, the famous Turgenev and Tolstoy. This realistic type of novel is very much distinctive in its type from prose romance or chivalric romance. Though they are not lacking in elements of realism, they can't be called the realistic type. Or on the other hand, historical novel, which is another subtype, we are coming to discuss that. Even historical novel exploring much in the elements of realism may not be typically called socio-realistic fiction. So, elements of realism can be in a prose romance. Elements of realism, real life experience, can be in a historical novel or even a psychological novel. But at the same time, this social realism is a very different thing which continues to hold its sway for the large part of the late 18th, 19th and even 20th centuries, and even today. In most cases, the popular novels that we get, even in our Bengali or Hindi literature, the kind of short stories Munshi Premchand or Phanishwarnath Renu were writing, or the kinds of novels Vibhuti Bhushan, Tarashankar, Manik Bandyopadhyay were writing, most of them follow this social realism type. Now let's come to another subtype, that is historical novel. Now some realistic novels obviously make use of events or personalities or characters from the historical past to add interest and a kind of picturesqueness to the narrative. Also, some writers can use it for creating a kind of nostalgic effect. Nostalgia for the past is some kind of inherent romanticism available in most of the people. Of course, there can be differences. Of course, there can be exceptional people who don't like the past at all, who don't have any longing or nostalgic feeling for the past. But in most cases, people have a general tendency of a mellowed fondness, a longing, a kind of yearning for the things of the past. So, many writers have indeed used historical events or personages or forms of understanding in several narratives. But what we call historical novel as a particular distinguished subtype, it began in the Western world, especially in England, with Sir Walter Scott. He was a novelist belonging to what we chronologically and conceptually, ideologically, culturally have termed the Romantic Age or the Romantic Revival in the early 19th century. At the same time when Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were writing their kind of a new exploration into the life of the simple common people, and in a sense sometimes going to the supernatural, sometimes going to the medieval past, and especially going back to nature in a greater sense. It is at the same time Sir Walter Scott brought a new taste in the English literary scene. This began with Waverley, and the track followed by Waverley came to be known as the track for historical novel itself. Waverley is a single novel, but it has come to be used as a generic name for several other novels Scott wrote in this period, all of them based on or set in the recent past, not very much earlier, the 17th century, 18th century kind of social and cultural scenario, the political tensions that have been affecting the life of the common people in the rural sides of northern England and Scotland. And the term historical novel can also be very much democratic. It does not mean that necessarily an author, an artist have to incorporate characters belonging to the higher rungs of society, only the kings and queens and the aristocrats. No. Sir Walter Scott showed how a historical novel can be at the same time very much sympathetic and realistic and lifelike in its portrayal of the common people. Scott's novels are of course using historical personages, very notable aristocratic figures from the history of England and Scotland. Sometimes also kings and queens do come as characters in his pages, but they are not the protagonists in most cases. The protagonists are culled from the middle class or the rural aristocrats, the rural gentry, small landlords, or the common people. Even when the common people are not coming as the main protagonists, at the same time we can see them in a very important sector of popular understanding and exchange. So the wide arena of the gamblers, the highwaymen, people belonging to the farming job and the dairy job in the rural sides of England and Scotland, the Jacobites, the Puritans, even The very common people, like people on the street, people on the road, eccentric mad characters, this rural mad woman, sometimes viewed as a kind of witch figure, which reflects back to the still pertaining post-medieval hangover in the life of Scotland. So these character types have come to populate the pages of his historical novels and making it all the more dynamic. So one very noted Marxist critic, Georg Lukács, in his famous book on the historical novel, he has hailed Sir Walter Scott, notwithstanding whatever political allegiance he might have had personally. Lukács has hailed him, celebrated him as one of the greatest propagator of the democratic views in his novels. Of course, in some of his novels, like Ivanhoe, which is obviously set in the medieval period, or in Kenilworth, which is set during the Renaissance period in the Elizabethan time in England, or Rob Roy. Rob Roy is very interestingly modeled on the fictional character, which has much resemblance with the famous iconic Robin Hood. So, these characters from the folklores, from the historical past of England and Scotland, of course, populate his pages, but the center of attraction, whose lifestyle is he portraying actually? It is the common people. How the historical changes, sometimes seen through a very sensible upper middle class or someone coming from the rural aristocracy, the rural gentry, such a character, sometimes viewed through their eyes, the novel is actually focusing on the historical changes, the pattern of the changes, what social, economic, religious and cultural upheavals are affecting the society in the larger sense, the community on the whole, the common people's life. That is becoming the key matter of understanding his historical novels. And after Sir Walter Scott, in the 19th century, in the later part of the 19th century, several other Victorian writers adapted this version of history. For example, George Eliot in Romola, in Henry Esmond, Thackeray, many other writers accepted the form of historical realism. And this also became so popular not only in England but also in Europe that several famous novels, cult classics in world history, in world literature, like the writings of Turgenev, Pushkin, Balzac, and sometimes also Tolstoy. In America, we can name Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, which was set in Georgia during the Civil War and the Reconstruction. All these novels came in the same line of Sir Walter Scott's pioneering way, his leading point towards the subtype called historical fiction. But after the 19th century, more or less at the very beginning of the 20th century, this form lost its popularity to some extent because of the First World War was coming, and after the First World War, the human experience completely changed. And people were no longer in the position to enjoy some 800 or 1000 page long historical novel and to remain nostalgic and dabbing in the glory of the past, thinking about the past in a fonding, yearning, longing manner. That was no longer possible. So with the change of time and with the sway of a new disturbing, striving reality, the historical novel could not hold its sway for a long time. That we must accept.